This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Parshas Vayechi and Sefer Bereishis end in a very unusual way. The pasuk says, "Vayamos Yosef ben Me'ah ve'eser shanim." Yosef died at 110 years old. Vayachantu, I say they embalmed him. Vayisem ba'arayin b'mitzrayim. They put him in a box in Egypt. Wow, what a very uplifting ending. What a happy ending. Bereishis ends, they took Yosef, they put him in a box. Aren't you supposed to end on a good note? Aren't you supposed to end on a positive note? You're not supposed to end b'derech tzara, and yet Sefer Bereishis ends, they took Yosef and they put him in a box. What an unusual ending. It occurred to me, we recently had the zchus to go to Morocco to visit many kivrei tzaddikim. One of the tzaddikim we learnt about was buried in the city of Meknez. His name was Hamalach Rabbi Raphael. Rabbi Raphael Bardugo. Rabbi Raphael Bardugo, he was born in 1747. He passed away in 1822. He was someone who was niskadesh v'nis'aleh through tremendous hasmadas haTorah. In fact, Rabbi Yosef Mimran testified that one time, in the middle of the night, he wanted to clarify something in learning, so he went to the house of Raphael Bardugo and he saw that Rabbi Raphael was learning with his payas tied to the wall, so in case his head would get heavy, he would be caught in midair. In other words, it would be impossible for him to fall asleep. Furthermore, his feet were above a bucket of ice-cold water. This is the hasmada of Rabbi Raphael Bardugo. When it came time for him to pass away, in 1822, Tav Kuf Pei Beis, he was 75 years old. It was the night of Hoshana Rabbah, when he finished learning the Idra, where it talks about the Histalkos of the Rashbi. And he had prepared for himself his own Arayin. And he asked that he be buried in an Arayin. Why? Because he did not see Tipas Keri Afilu Ba'ainas. Ayam B'naira. What's the meaning of because he was so tahar, he wanted to be buried in an Arayin? What's the meaning of this? If you look in the Sefer Chesed Li Avraham, Chesed Li Avraham was written by Rabbi Avram Azulai. When we went to Morocco, we learned that there were 4 Rabbi Avram Azulais in history. One was from the Gerushi Sfarad. The next was the great-great-grandfather of the Chida, the author of Sefer Chesed Li Avraham. The third was the great Makubal Rabbi Avram Azulai, who's buried in Marrakesh, and then his grandson was the fourth. We're talking about the second Rabbi Avram Azulai, great-great-grandfather of the Chida. He writes in Mayan Revi'i, Nahar Memvav, that you should know the madrega of a tzaddik is dependent on Shmiras HaMitzvah and Shmiras HaBris B'Tahara. He says there are 2 kinds of tzaddikim. But to be really called a tzaddik, you need to be Bali De Nisayon and overcome it like Yosef HaTzadik. But Mi Shaloi Bali De Nisayon, even though he's Shomer the Bris, he's called a tzaddik and not a tzaddik Gomor though. To be a tzaddik Gomor, you need to be Shomer the Bris when you're a Bali De Nisayon. Says the Chesed Li Avram, someone who's not a tzaddik is not roy to be buried in an Arayin. It's interesting. In Eretz Yisrael, they don't bury in an Arayin. Really, if someone is not a total tzaddik, he should not be buried in an Arayin. Someone who's buried in an Arayin, they're medaktek imay kechod hasara. But if they wouldn't be buried in an Arayin, they would only be punished on averos chamurais. Therefore, the only person buried in an Arayin in the Chumash is Yosef, because he's a tzaddik and he was Bali De Nisayon. Ayam B'naira. So only someone who reaches the highest madrega of tzaddik yisoid olam, who's shomer the bris even when they're Bali De Nisayon, is who? Yosef HaTzadik. Vayisem ba'arayin b'mitzrayim. So according to this Chesed Li Avram, from which we learn from the great Hanhaga of Raphael Bardugo, who was also on this madrega of Tahara, and he was buried in Arain, that the pinnacle of human achievement, the greatest madrega one could reach, is when they're buried in an Arain, when they're shomer the bris. It could be we could interpret Vayisem ba'arain b'Mitzrayim. Even though he was in Mitzrayim and he was in Ervas ha'aretz, still he reached such a madrega. So Bereishis doesn't end on a bad note. Bereishis ends on the greatest possible note. Look what a human being could achieve. A human being could live with such kedusha v'tahara that he could withstand the midas hadin of being buried in an arayin. Look what this olam has. It has its tzaddik yisoid olam. We have foundation in the world. Bereishis ends on the highest madrega a human being could reach. One could possibly say that Adam Arishain, who was nichshal in this inyan in the 130 years from when he was pirish from Chava, that was the beginning of Bereishis, which was precipitated by the Ched of the Yetz Hadas. Bereishis ends with great tikkun. Yosef HaTzadik was masaking the inyan of Tahara to the extent that Vayisem ba'arain b'Mitzrayim, and from this we could take Chazak, V'nis Chazak. We could mechazik ourselves. Look what we're able to achieve. We could reach the madrega of Yosef HaTzadik, Tzadik Yisoid Olam. With this we begin Sefer Shemais, that even when we're in Mitzrayim, Erbas Haaretz, we have the Yisoid of Yosef HaTzadik. Wishing everyone a good tavach and a wonderful haschala of Sefer Shemais.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.